I'm Rhoda Zahler Samuel with the Jewish Historical Society of Greater New Haven. I'm here today in our archives at 270 Fitch Street on the campus of Southern Connecticut State University with Judith Judy Schiff, to talk to her about some of her memories of growing up in New Haven and about some of her work as the chief research archivist at Yale Sterling Library and the city historian, and her work as a founding member of both the Jewish Historical Society and the Ethnic Heritage Center. So Judy, so much has been written about you, and I appreciate your sharing so much, but there are a few little details that we just wanted to fill in today.
Yes.
Let's start by talking about your parents, your family, what brought them to New Haven, what was it like, growing up when you were growing up in New Haven?
Well, I've been delving into some of that myself. I have a newfound cousin, a third cousin Judy. I already had a cousin Judy, but a second cousin in Washington has started something called the Schiff Family Newsletter, and she's delving into this, and we still have yet to discover who was the first person, the first Schiff family member to move into Connecticut, because it was a kind of reverse immigration. Everybody in the family settled in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and then someone started an immigration eastward shortly after the World War I, and by 1920 and 21 there were a number of members of our family living in New Haven, Bridgeport, and possibly Waterbury. And we're still trying to figure out what marriage or what business arrangement brought that first person, because everybody seemed to do well in Connecticut. And even if they stopped in some other places en route, they seemed to end up in Connecticut. So my first memories really are of going to Woodmont in the summer, where my father's two sisters, Dorothy and Lillian, would rent a house. I don't believe they owned it, but would have a house on the main part of, near what they used to call Bagel Beach, the main part of Woodmont, and we would stay there for certain weekends or weeks in the summer. We lived in New York City. I was an only child, and I have a lot of photographs of Woodmont, even albums that were given to me by my Aunt Lillian. My father was one of 4 children. His father emigrated to the U.S. about 1905 from Orsha, Russia, a large city not too far from Moscow in what it would now be Belarus. And the story is that when my grandfather arrived in New York, he was sort of overwhelmed by all the congestion, and somehow the story is that he found himself sitting in Union Square Park and ran into a fellow person, either from Orsha or someone he could speak Russian to. And the friend said, "Let's go to Columbus. I hear it's a wonderful city with a lot of opportunity." And so the story is that they got on the train and went to Columbus. And so that's where my father grew up. And there were 4 children, fairly close in age. And as I say, one by one, they all ended up back in Connecticut. My grandfather, Isidore Schiff, I've found in the records, he died before I was born at a relatively young age, and I never knew him, but he had a grocery store, at least at some time in the early 20s on Congress Avenue, but not there long thereafter, due to the economic drive of his 2 daughters, Dorothy and Lillian, ended up as being one of the pioneers in the Jewish development of Miami Beach, and spent most of his life there, except in the summers he would operate a store at Woodmont, a kind of a general store on Bagel Beach, a delicatessen, and those stores where I guess you could go in and get anything, a beach hat or a deli sandwich or whatever.
Do you know what the name of the store was?
I think it was just known as Schiff's, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There were older people of this society years ago who remembered my grandfather, knew that he was a part of the building of the the congregation there, and that he would be there through the high holidays and then go back to Miami Beach. But getting back to my aunts, as I say, one of them married into the Fleischner family of New Haven, my Aunt Dorothy. They settled in Bristol, where she, or through her husband, they opened a dress shop called Dorothy's. It became very prosperous, and she ended up living most of her life. Eventually, when she was widowed, she moved back to be near the Fleischner family in New Haven and died in New Haven. But her sister Lillian was part of this movement in the 20s to sort of see if you could hit it rich in Miami Beach. And my Aunt Dorothy went too, but that couple hated the climate. There was no air conditioning then, the bugs, the lizards, whatever they ran into, and they didn't last down there. But my Aunt Lillian was part of this movement to build small hotels on South Beach, and also was there during up through World War II and later, and prospered very well there. And so that was where my grandmother and my grandfather lived through most of the year, and I usually saw my grandmother only in the summer. Well, after a couple of summers or so, I see photographs in my album of myself and my cousin Judy, and it'll say the two Judys, age 2 at Woodmont, that kind of thing. And when World War II broke out, my parents decided to move to New Haven. I was quite young. I hadn't started school or anything. There was a lot of activity, Bundist activity, other unsettling activity. They lived somewhere in Queens. I think it was in or near Astoria. And of course, there was the Long Island Sound was also close to New Haven. But there were even reports of German submarines, spies. There was a lot of alarm in that. And also, having the support of so many relatives living in New Haven, they decided to move to New Haven. And
How old were you then?
I would have been about 3, when just turning 4 when the war broke out. My father was one of 4. His mother was one of 4 sisters, and these 4 sisters were very close. Hannah Feldman was of the Feldman family, and then there was my grandmother, who had various first names depending on how they were sort of Americanized. They called her Simmy, Selma, Celia, Schiff, anyway, was her last name. And as I say, she was sort of not bi-coastal, but north and south bi-coastal. And Sarah was the last one to leave Russia. She was a midwife that was almost a doctor. They said if she could have been another time, she would have been a doctor, but she was called a midwife. And she actually married a well-to-do man. I don't know if he was, I guess he was Jewish too, but he lived in a wealthier style than we think of Jewish people, actually in Moscow. And she had to actually escape by jumping over a wall. She always compared herself to the stories in Dr. Zhivago about how people who had big houses had to share them with many people. And one of the more kindly tenants, communist tenants that was put in with her, said, "Escape with your children tonight, because tomorrow they're coming to get you." And they literally had to jump over the wall. So she eventually made her way to New Haven, and married a Boris Berman in New Haven as her second or third husband, whatever, second, I think, husband. So then I also got to know all these other families that were incorporated in. Then the youngest member was Minnie. Minnie Levine married a Harry Levine, and they lived in New Haven. And he died before I was born, too, probably around the time my grandfather did. So I only knew Minnie. And Minnie also was living most of her life by the time I knew her in Florida, but would always come back to visit various people in New Haven, like the Podoloff family was a very close friend. And she would point out there's a big apartment house on Orange Street, sort of Spanish style. I think it's at the corner of Humphrey or something. And she said that she had owned this apartment house at one time. And Harry was something who was some kind of promoter or developer of Wilcox's Pier at Savin Rock. I'm telling you these shreds of stories, but they might fit in with they might fit in with somebody else's. So these were most of the little shreds of stories that I heard. But with these four sisters, and at least 2 or 3 of them were usually around at any one time. The core of 2 who lived in New Haven, and the other 2, one or the other was usually visiting for an extended period of time. We would have the big Sunday dinners. Everybody was conscious of their Jewish heritage, but I don't think they were great keepers exactly of the Sabbath, shall we say. It seemed to me, I remember mainly having these big Sabbath-type dinners on a Sunday afternoon, but, there would just be the groaning table board and dozens of people around eating. That's what I remember a lot from my childhood. So maybe I've talked enough about all of that. Do you want to ask another question?
Yeah. What? Tell me about the schools that you went to, and what that was like.
Okay. Well, we started in the Westville area. I went to Benton School, which was torn down to build Beth El Kesser Israel, and it was it was a very old-fashioned school. We always thought it had been built around the time of the Civil War, but I did look it up, and I think it was built around 1900. But people who were born in my generation, born, say, in the late Depression, or going into the World War II period, it was a time when not a lot of things had been modernized. Things had been invented, but they couldn't be implemented. I mean, we knew about the World's Fair of 1939, television, microwave, but all these things were actually yet to be built because of the Depression and then going into the consumer controls of World War II. So this school, which had very little money lavished on it, as did the schools of New Haven, but we always had good teachers because of the Teachers College, State Teachers College, then now Southern Connecticut being right there in town. And most of the teachers were either Jewish, Irish, or Italian. That's what I always remember as the core of the teachers of that time, and they were very conscientious. But I do remember going to the bathroom was like being escorted into the dungeon somewhere. It was very dark in the basement, and we had the chain pull toilets. And just getting through that process could take ages as people took their turns. But it was a very good school.
What was the student population like in terms of
I would say it was very diverse. It included all, and there were no fights. Everybody got along. I think, at least in most of the parts of New Haven I've lived in, I mean, that's been my experience. I know in the civil rights period there were a few burnings and this and that, but they were, I think, mainly economic expressions of frustration. I don't think people really had fights with each other because of their religion. In fact, the only fights I really remember at Hill House, and they weren't deadly, were very often, say, between one Catholic church and another. The Polish against some that had some church near each other, maybe on State Street or Grand Avenue, and they might have some turf war or something like that they argued about. But in terms of being black, white, or what country you came from, and of course there was that difficulty when we were very little, because Italy was not on our side at the beginning of World War II. But no one ever really paid attention to that. It was always kind of very carefully, never, there was Mussolini, but you never really associated him with the Italian people of New Haven. People were very kind about that, I think.
Right, and you started going to Sunday school at Michigan Israel as a child?
Yes, I was very young. First of all, I was an only child, and so whatever there was to be lavished was, I think, within their means, was certainly lavished upon me. And my parents had been married a long time before I came along. So, yes, I think even it was a preschool time. And at the same time, I went to day camp at the old Jewish Center, which was on Dwight Street. And I remember we had swimming lessons at the Y, because they did not have a pool there. And I did not like learning to swim in the Y pool because it was very deep and it was scary and you had to look down, and it was very hot at the Jewish Center too. Altogether, I was not, although I liked the activities there, I remember we used to have a summer Purim party, and we would dress up as Queen Esther in the middle of the summer. And that part was fun. But the next year, I know my mother never learned to swim because she grew up in Ohio too, and there are no lakes in Ohio, only rivers and man-made lakes. So she was very anxious that I learned to swim at an early age, and so conveniently, the Girl Scouts had a camp at Woodmont, right on the beach, and I was used to that beach, and we all went there anyway. So that's where I went until I was too old to go to day camp. I never went to the Jewish overnight camp, and there were a number of Jewish girls who followed that same pattern with me. We just loved the beach at Woodmont and having the swimming lessons there and all the craft lessons we had. And it was in a big old mansion-type summer house. And we had certain nights, 2 or 3 maybe in the time of the summer that we were there, where we would also sleep overnight. Mm-hmm. And no one ever wanted to go anyplace else once they started in that camp. But I did go every year to the Sunday school, as they first called it, at Michigan Israel, and then Sabbath school. And it was intense. We had teachers who were usually graduate students at Yale, or actual teachers making some extra money. And we had textbooks that were very careful reform education textbooks it followed a prescribed course, from very simple stories up to some fairly heavyweight books by the time you got to be 14 or 15 when you were confirmed. And there were no bat mitzvahs for girls at that time. So confirmation was the big thing, and you had a very big program of a cantata, and you wore a gown that looked like a college type of gown. And everything I did there I enjoyed very much. The educational part. We had temple youth conferences that would meet in various cities in New England, and when we got to be, say, 12 and above, we were able to go to those overnights. It was exciting because Reform Judaism went through a lot of changes at that time. It had come from a time of being, I would say, almost virtual Unitarianism, with, in some cases, reading back in the older records of Michigan Israel before my time. I mean, they were actually thinking of changing their Sabbath to Sunday, because they felt it would be much more in keeping with the rest of the community, and they could all do things together. Well, it was not that way when I went. We did have Sabbath at the traditional time, but there was never any particular stress on strict observance or the kosher laws or anything like that.
What was stressed?
I would stress, I would say, though, it was a coming back to traditions in many other ways. For example, they had never had a cantor at Michigan Israel. And Rabbi Goldberg, who was the beloved rabbi of that time through most of my growing up, at the very beginning I did have Edgar Siskin, but I didn't get to know him too well, and I was very little at the time. But Rabbi Goldberg was just a person that you felt anything he told you, you could trust, you could believe in. He was very inspirational. And I think one of the stories you've already heard was where he would relate how he had to persuade the congregation to hire a cantor. And this was at a time when the board was all powerful. The rabbis didn't seem to have much power. They were all at the mercy of the board of directors. And they finally said they would pay for a musical director, but he'd have to be called a musical director and not a cantor. And looking back now, all these things seem very unusual. But Rabbi Goldberg said, no, I'm putting my future on this, and unless he's called a cantor, I'm quitting, I'm resigning. So they didn't want him to leave, and so we had Cantor Harry Sebron, and he was an amazing also youth director. This was, I can remember one of the things at the time that was very popular was South Pacific was new. And he just thought this was the most wonderful vehicle for teaching understanding and diversity and the acceptance of other races. And he would really analyze the songs and teach us to sing them as part of our Sunday school and Sabbath school work. And he also went with us to the summer camps that they had in Barnstable, Mass. This was Temple youth from all over New England, where we had a certain amount of religious education, but most of it was as you would enjoy any type of camp, with just the usual swimming and craft and dancing type activities. So it was a very rich and full life that I enjoyed. In fact, by the time I got to high school, and we're getting into the period, of course, after Israel had its independence, the state of Israel was proclaimed, that Hebrew was actually taught at the Hill House High School, and I took it for 2 years. I had not much Hebrew before, but at the same time, Michigan Israel had a Hebrew school, which they taught on Wednesdays, and I began doing that in junior high school. So I was studying both more traditional Hebrew and modern Hebrew at the same time. And I was very proud that in Hill House I got a Golden Iron Award for my work being a studious scholar in modern Hebrew, which was very interesting. And I remember we used to we thought we were very smart alecky we used to send notes phonetically written in Hebrew to secret notes. I mean, they would be English in words, but they'd be spelled phonetically with Hebrew letters and the vowels and so forth, so that if a teacher or somebody who wasn't supposed to get it would not know what the content of these notes were.
Was Hebrew an after-school program, or was it part of the regular language?
No, it was a regular
academic.
It counted the same as Latin or French.
Wow.
Or Spanish. No, you went every day, and and we had a textbook. I mean, you really studied the cases and tenses just the same way you would study any language. Yeah. So that was quite interesting, and the whole focus on celebrating Israel. That was a very big part of and following the political changes that took place in the 50s. I wasn't part of too much of the civil rights movement. I mean, I was as an adult when you get into the late 60s, but the 50s were certainly an era of revolutions. It was the Hungarian Revolution, and then more recently I've been reflecting back with the death of Castro in Cuba. Everybody at that time was in favor of the Cuban Revolution. You were getting rid of all these gambling lords and all of the terrible administration in Cuba. And while I was at Barnard, Castro came to Manhattan, and he stayed in a hotel in Harlem. And he came in a parade in a Jeep right within, as close almost as you are to me, at 116th Street and Broadway, and stopped there and waved at all the students were cheering. So opinion gradually changed about him because, as often happens, say, with the Russian Revolution too, it's wonderful at the time, and people were liberated by it, Jews and non-Jews back in Russia, but times need to change, and they unfortunately, we're seeing that in Russia, they haven't changed too much again.
Are there any other memories of Rabbi Goldberg that you want to share?
Everything that he did seemed to be a model for things that should happen then and that happened later. He was a very close friend of the Reverend Sloane Coffin. They led freedom rides to the South. In my time in the Sunday school, I remember not only did I complete confirmation, but he also had they had an optional program for high school years too. And it didn't meet as regularly, maybe met once a month or twice a month, something like that. Very often in the rabbi's home too. And that's where I first heard Tom Lehrer and the folk songs. He would play the records for us. And then he actually had one Sunday afternoon, I believe, I don't think it was at nighttime, a cafe for a black church and ourselves to come, and we had music and we had dancing. And it was a very new thing to actually be encouraging dancing with an African American or a Negro, as we would have called them at that time. But he did it, and he held it, and it was it was a very successful venture. I don't know if it got written up anywhere, but I know that some parents were nervous, not because they didn't want us to do it, but of what other people might write about it or come to picket it perhaps or something like that, but nothing like that happened. Yeah.
Where did he live?
He lived in Hamden, I think somewhere in the Spring Glen to Millbrook area there off of Whitney Avenue. Yeah. He lived with his mother, and he remained a bachelor until he passed away. Of course, his most famous act, which always got written up anytime he retired or probably in his obituaries, was that he had converted Marilyn Monroe to Judaism and married Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe. And some people doubted the intensity of the course, I guess, of instruction. But supposedly she did meet with him at least a couple of times and become introduced and agree to convert.
I'd forgotten about that. You went to Sheridan Middle School and then Hill House High School.
Yes.
Are there any things that stand out in
Well,
terms of...
Sheridan was then a junior high. We had junior highs in those days. And in some ways I think it was
It
an
was 7th,
easier...
8th, 9th?
It was 7th, 8th, and 9th. So you never had sort of that difficult freshman year, I think, in a way of entering high school and being at the very bottom of 4 years. You were already used to that type of class, and you were already 1 year older, and you were only 3 years in high school. So I think, especially for boys, it probably helped them a little bit. Sheridan was one of the smallest of the junior highs and was known to have, again, very excellent teachers. The one unusual thing was that Herman Sherman, they had a course in those days called Core, where you studied English and history together in a correlated program. And the whole core actually even involved art. In your art, if you were studying Egyptian history, you had art that studied Egyptian architecture and so forth. But the teacher of my core class, Herman Sherman, was also the principal of the Sunday school, Michigan Israel. So he kind of kept tabs on you in both ways. So sometimes people felt that was a little bit much, but we survived it. And Sheridan was a wonderful school. It was very small. Everybody knew each other. You had homerooms where everybody was mixed together. Hill House was very different. It was huge. There were over 2,000 students in 3 grades.
It was down on Tower Parkway.
It was, yes, it was between the gym and the graduate school. It extended from Tower Parkway, the extension of Grove Street, almost all the way back to York Street. Because not only did it have that old part that we see in the pictures at the front, but it had something known as the annex. And the annex went all along that alley, right almost up to Toad's there. And so even getting around in Hill House was a challenge. You were given either 10 or 15 minutes to change classes, and sometimes you could barely make it.
About how many students? How many were in your class, your graduating class?
Over 600. So coming from a small school, I think it was pretty much the same with the 4 junior highs that were in the city, that it was very difficult to meet new people. We had a cafeteria that was enormous. I mean, it was the size of a basement of a large building, but they had to have so many shifts. You only had 20 minutes to eat, so you never had time. You could barely find a seat at these picnic tables. Like, think of a prison with just endless rows of picnic tables. You could barely find a seat, let alone try to find your friends or make new friends in that time allotted. Just getting there, sitting down, and getting back out of there. The one highlight I remember is, and there have been a lot of them that I've experienced, was that's where the 5 Satins started singing, and we used to hear them singing while we were having our lunch. I don't know how they had time to sing. Maybe they ate at another time. But this was where the singing group, the 5 Satins, immortalized in the soundtrack of Dirty Dancing, were started. They did have different members that changed, but one of them, Freddie Paris, I think was his name, was in my class, and I think he was one that stayed with them. And they were one of the great a cappella rock groups of the 50s and early 60s. So that was very memorable. Hill House had a long-standing reputation. It was the second oldest public high school in the United States, next to Boys and Girls Latin. It had a lot of teachers that had PhDs because they were able to get them in the summers. At one time, Yale had a program where you could actually get a PhD by going part-time. And so you knew that if you did well at Hill House, you were pretty much able to get into the school of your choice. Now, college has always been expensive, and we thought it was expensive then, but it was more doable, I think. First of all, the costs, I think, were more in tune with what people were able to make in jobs on the side. Nowadays, it's hard for people even to take jobs very often because they're expected to intern at companies or to take special travel that prepares them for a course that they're taking the next year. But, and the semesters were very different. We didn't start college until about October 1st. Nowadays they start it, and they have longer years but with more vacations, but the vacations don't really help you earn money particularly. But I was able to work almost 4 months from sort of mid-May through September each year. So although I had a scholarship, I was still able to earn quite a bit of money, and I had a good job at Eastern Industries Incorporated, which for many years was in a building right on Broadway. And that building is still one of the few that is standing there, where Tyco is in that area next to Tyco. It moved to Hamden in a new facility, and there were a couple of other people from Hill House that were able to get jobs there too. But I was earning $2 an hour. In fact, when I first started working at Yale, my pay was lower at Yale than it was from the summer job that I had at Eastern Industries. And it was in a beautiful new building in Hamden. I was always pretty good on talking on the telephone, so they put me in the purchase expediting department, and they would say, "Call General Motors and give them hell," they would say. And I dutifully would call them, and I was polite, but they were amazed that I would even call them. And they'd say, "They say your motor will be here in 6 weeks," or something like that. So I got caught up on the work there, and they put me into a room that was filled with file cabinets, and they said, "Maybe you can do something with our files." So that was my first exposure to archives. And I remember pulling open the drawers and seeing all these rusty paper clips, and I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a good idea if they're trying to save these papers. So years later, I realized that I guess I was in some ways born to be an archivist from that side, although the real interest comes from the study of history, not so much the care of the papers, which is important too.
Right. Now you were in New Haven at the beginning of the whole urban renewal era and a lot of redevelopment in the
Yes.
city. What were your impressions of what was going on then?
Well, again, people bring different viewpoints from their experiences. In the large family that I've been talking about, and the 4 grandmothers, one of my grandmothers, Hannah Feldman, my great aunt, she actually was the sister of my grandmother, had 2 sons. One of her sons, George, went to Yale, a class of 1935. The younger son, Larry Feldman, was a boyhood friend of a man named Dick Lee. And they grew up together in the very poor New Hallville neighborhood. In fact, they said they used to get free lunches by cleaning out the spittoons in some of the bars along Dixwell Avenue. So I had somewhat of an inside story about Dick Lee. And of course, we also got to know him as the announcer at the summer concerts at the Bowl, which were a big feature of my life growing up. These wonderful concerts, people that we saw in the movies, like Hosea Torby, who played with Jane Powell and who was our favorite movie actress, teenage star at that time. So, and he had a wonderful speaking voice, a wonderful presentation manner, and built up a huge following by being the MC at these summer concerts at the Yale Bowl. But he was a very dedicated man. He grew up poor. and he really wanted to reform New Haven. He had a lot of dedication. He knew, as he always said, he didn't have a Yale degree. Eventually, I think he did get an honorary degree, but he felt he had a Yale education. He was lucky in that he was he was drafted but considered unfit for service. He was ill, and he went to work and eventually worked his way to be the news bureau director at Yale. So he was in charge of media and writing up and writing press releases and so forth. And he got to know a lot of people that way. And the people that he relied on the most were the people in the architecture school and city planning. And he took most of their directives from him. And this was an era where people were moving up from the South, had already moved to work at Winchester's when the war ended. It was a dead end for people. They had no jobs, the jobs were falling off, and the public housing was very much needed. And there was money for public housing. And in addition, you of course would know all of this too, but as I understand it, the preservation movement had not really been born in America. It was not even talked about, certainly at the School of City Planning at Yale. And all of the money was for slum clearance. You had to declare something a slum and clear it in order to build something new. And so that was the only way they could get money at that time. And some people were happy with that because they were older, they were living in houses they no longer needed anymore. They were happy to, I know a couple of my mother's friends who would say had a 2-3 family house near the Scranton school out that way. Yes, it was good housing stock that could have been saved probably if they hadn't had that plan to build Route 34 through. But these people were happy to have someone who would buy these houses, and they could move to a nice clean little apartment on Upper Whaley Avenue or somewhere in Westville and be within walking distance of Beth Elkes or Israel. So, I mean, there are two sides to all of these stories. Mm-hmm. And yes, there was redlining. The black families that had to move out could not move where they should have. And maybe the redlining slipped by the housing authority. I don't know all of the inside stories of those. But we do have Dick Lee's papers at Yale. And a lot of the photograph files are there as well as in the New Haven Museum. And you can see that much of that housing did have to be cleared. I mean, they sort of lumped together the hill into a neighborhood that encompasses many levels of economics that are in there. But there were tenements, and they don't really bring State Street into it much, but I think some of the worst housing was actually tenement housing along State Street, where you had several families on a floor, one bathroom, no good heating systems. They really, to salvage them in a preservation way, would have cost, if they could have gotten the money, far, far more than raising them and either leaving them empty or building something more modern on their site. So I think I have a more sympathetic attitude toward what happened in redevelopment, because Vincent Scully's advice, which eventually was followed, thankfully, to save City Hall and a lot of other buildings, was not right there in 1955. I think the 10 years going from the mid-50s into the late 60s, a lot of things changed in people's theories of what redevelopment of a city should be like.
Mm-hmm. 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 In the late 60s, there were, some troubles with riots and the famous trial. Mm-hmm. But you were out of New Haven at that time.
No, actually, I was working for Yale in the late 60s.
Okay.
And I was working at Yale actually when all of during the student strike. They didn't do anything to impede our working. I mean, it was just kind of business as usual. There were also a lot of employee strikes that were going on at intervals in those years when Kingman Brewster was president. And but we always had a feeling that we were safe. We never felt threatened in any way. I think the only time I remember during an employee strike was being sort of threatened by someone in the library in Human Resources who said, professional people shouldn't be mingling with people who are on strike. And when we said, well, they're our friends.
Mhm.
And so, we'd go out while they were on the picket line and give them hot coffee or whatever they wanted us to do for them, we would do. So, and we generally ignored that, and nothing happened to us either. In terms of May Day itself, I don't know that we were always totally fully informed. I do remember driving my mother and her friends all around the city when it was being armed by the National Guard, and we were kind of surprised that it had gone that far that quickly. Whether we were naive or just that it wasn't that fully described in the paper, I don't know. But I do remember driving up to Sheridan and seeing the Sheridan schoolyard filled with tanks. I know that they had guards around the Grove Street Cemetery, whether they were afraid that it would just be defaced or that people might hide out there and be hard to find. And of course there was a bombing in the Ingalls Rink. A bomb was set off there. So it was very serious, and yet it wasn't serious, because I do know that I was tempted. I thought about going down to the Green on that May Day gathering, but I was already active in the League of Women Voters, and we were pretty much aligned with the NAACP and the Urban League too. And most of the black people in New Haven, especially those with kids, they said, we're all leaving New Haven that weekend. Don't stay in New Haven, and don't add to the crowd that's there, plus you might endanger yourself. So most of the people I think on the Green were either younger people who just thought it was a lark or didn't care, or people who were there for a purpose. Who had come in from out of town and really wanted to be there for the gathering of the radicals. And, well, Allen Ginsberg was there. There were others who were, in the more literary line, shall we say, who were involved too. It was handled very skillfully by Sam Chauncey. He worked with the FBI and other groups behind the scenes to minimize the dangers of what would happen in New Haven. A lot of that we didn't find out until later, and even in his book recently published, of how I guess it was the Weathermen, some of the worst groups that were coming from Boston, were offered two chartered buses to come to New Haven, and they very conveniently went off the side of the road, parked, and the two drivers disappeared, leaving them stranded on the Mass Pike. And they took the whatever it is, the distributor cap or something along with them, so that no one who could drive on the bus could get these buses started. So certain of the worst elements never made it to New Haven. I know there were some burnings of stores on Congress Avenue. Maybe you've had some testimonies on them. A few of the stores were owned by Jewish owners and their contents, but it seemed to have been a sporadic thing and not anything that persisted long after the initial damage was done, as far as I know.
So there was a quick recovery?
In my mind, there was. Maybe, I lived in a world, I guess, of people who were not as, who were treating each other in a more equitable way. But I never saw any problem with the African American groups, political groups, or meeting groups that I ever worked with. We always seemed to have very good relationships. I know they've talked about white flight to the suburbs, and certainly the composition of the schools did change in the 60s, and I guess continuing on from there. A lot of it too, though, I think it's just as people get wealthier. A lot of people just moved to better housing. There wasn't much housing that was middle class affordable in New Haven. A lot of the housing in Westville was quite pricey. Certainly in East Rock it was pricey. And they really hadn't gotten to the stage of today where they take a lot of these older houses and divide them up into co-ops or condominiums. It was more of an all or nothing situation, I think. And whereas you had so many tracts in Branford and Hamden of small homes that were affordable, especially if you were a veteran. So I think it was somewhat of a class, more, at least to a degree, a class separation, just as much as it might have been not wanting to go to school with someone from another race. I think that entered into it to a degree.
But how were the schools affected by all this?
Well, when I went to high school, the schools were, both high schools, there were only two, Cross and Hill House. They were across the street from each other. Hill House was...
Wasn't there a commercial high school as
Yes,
well?
it was called, it had been called commercial, but it was renamed Wilbur-Cross, and they had equal courses in both colleges. They had business, general, and collegiate academic courses. The Hill House was larger, was a much larger institution, and nothing was divided by race, but it was divided according to ability. And of course, ability is based on opportunity in many cases, so it doesn't always mean your native ability. And so we were very separated. I mean, in the time I was in Hill House, I don't think I had classes with at most more than 100 different people. We were always kept in a cluster. You were named in a division, and you went from your Latin class together to your English class together. And sometimes it was the same 30, basically, that I saw for the 3 years that were there. I happened, because I took Hebrew and because I also took art and art history, which took me into the Boardman Trade School, I got mixed with more people than some people did. Cross, I should say also that the city was largely divided in half, to a degree. I mean, it was a bigger half for Hill House because it was just a much bigger physical plant. That one part of the northern part of the city roughly went to Cross, the southern part roughly went to Hill House. The northern part of the city included from the Newhall bill, and it included the whole East Rock corridor. Now, most of the people that lived in the East Rock corridor were faculty children or otherwise upper class people who were all headed for private schools. They were going to Hopkins, they were going to Choate, they were going to all these schools in Upper Connecticut. Relatively few girls went to prep schools. There weren't that many that were that big, I don't think. And I think that the boys very often sometimes got the attention. Plus there was the huge, or at least huge compared to Sacred Heart, Notre Dame in West Haven that attracted a lot of gifted Catholic boys. So Cross ended up having relatively few, I would say, white, of those that should have gone there. But again, those people wouldn't have gone to any high school. They also, another feature in the schools were the neighboring towns, many of which did not have their own high schools. So North Haven, for example, did go to Cross though, and North Haven was probably 100% white. I don't think it was known to have any black population. And Woodbridge, Bethany, and Orange all went to Hill House. So it was hard. As they began to build their schools, then they would break off. I can remember we had a 150th birthday of Hill House not too many years ago, and the featured speaker that they tried to get was Vincent Scully, class of 35. He was still teaching. He had retired from Yale and was teaching at the University of Florida, of Miami. He couldn't make it. So they said, well, we're going to have a special Hill House alum, but since he may not be able to make it either, we're not going to announce it ahead. Well, it turned out to be Ernest Borgnine of the class of 35. Now, we knew he came from Hamden, so we said, we didn't even know he went to Hill House, but there was no Hamden High when he was a teenager, so he went to Hill House.
They built in 37.
And he talked about how he got his start at the York Square Players in Hill House, and then was almost a career man in the Navy, and his combination of knowing the Navy plus wanting to be an actor got him this part in McHale's Navy, which made him a star. And so it's interesting to see how some of these populations fed in and out of the high schools in New Haven. And now we have something like, I think, 12 high schools in New Haven. Some of the magnet schools, charter schools, and many of them actually drawing people from the suburbs, especially the Co-op High School for the Arts, where I've done some volunteer teaching over there. They bring students into New Haven from the other towns.
So you saw the JCC move from one place to another during your time here
Yes,
in New
I did.
Haven. Tell me about your experiences with the various...
Well, it was an amazing building. I mean, first of all, there weren't that many new buildings in New Haven as yet.
You're talking about Chapel Street.
Yeah, I'm talking about the new JCC on Chapel Street, which I think opened in 1953. The old one, you know, it did the best it could, but it was very hot, and then in the warm months it had no air conditioning. Its facilities were limited, and going into the JCC downtown, I mean, it was just an unbelievable facility with this enormous auditorium and smaller auditoriums, bowling alley, a swimming pool, all sorts of features that as a young person I didn't even delve into. I mean, the sauna, massage rooms, and whatever they had downstairs. And it was a mecca really for the whole city. Sunday afternoons, between whatever art shows they had, book discussions, I mean, there was something usually going on, maybe 3 or 4 different events at one time. And they had a pretty good parking lot, which is now the garage, which was made into the parking garage on York Street. So it was a very, very popular place. Now, getting back to high school again, this is a lot, but I mentioned that there was diversity, but good relations. Now, one separation came with sororities and fraternities. They were strictly according to religious and probably ethnic lines.
In high school.
In high school. And there were no sororities for Jewish girls. We had BBG girls, B'nai B'rith girls. And there were so many of these groups that there must have been 4 or 5 of them. And my group met at the Jewish Center. So I remember going to the Jewish Center a lot for these BBG groups for girls. And they also had at the Jewish Center dances for freshmen of Yale and high school girls, presumably all Jewish. I mean, I don't know, I guess they didn't check you, but most people knew that this was how they were organized. And although it seems maybe strange now, of course, people dated in very formal ways, and mothers were not afraid to have a high school daughter meet a freshman from Yale and go out to a football game or some approved date or dance that your parents knew exactly when you were coming home and so forth, and the rules of the game. And nobody seemed to have any problems with this, and it was a wonderful social aspect of the Jewish Center downtown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In your work as an archivist at Sterling, you have had some oversight and experience with their Jewish collection and also the New Haven collection. Can you say something about some of the highlights of those 2 particular aspects of your work?
Yes,
there?
well, I really got my career started at Yale. Well, first of all, I had a job in the economics department, a group called the Coles Foundation, which was an endowed economics research foundation, and it had many interesting people there who worked with the presidents in Washington and came back to Yale. And I enjoyed it, but then I heard about a job that was funded by the New Haven Foundation to process, catalog letters of New Haven families. And I had actually been an English history major, more or less, or 20th century in college. I thought that American history was kind of ordinary, I guess. And I thought that I should be, stretching my knowledge to other countries. But when I began to read these papers of New Haven families, I realized that American history was pretty interesting too, and it was much more accessible than having to travel to foreign repositories for research. And so even though I had a license already to teach history, I decided over time went back and forth. I went to the Columbia Graduate School in History and would take leaves of absence. Something always drew me back to the archives. Another consideration I had at the time, hard to know how that would have borne out over time, but from the practice teaching I had done while I was at Barnard College in New York and being exposed to the curriculum of that time, it was a very whitewashed version of American history. I, being a strong feminist from Barnard, didn't really feel comfortable with promulgating a lot of the history that was printed in the history books at that time about Native Americans, African Americans, Jews. I mean, it was pretty much the great white men's story of history. So that was another reason that I really wanted to keep away from from teaching history. I often thought that I might actually switch to English if I stayed in that field. Are you running out of tape?
We
I
can,
can
we
put
can
it in
switch.
another
We can put in
tape.
another tape.
But
Yeah.
there's 5 minutes left. Yeah, either gonna make
Okay.
a break or.
Do you want us to take a break now, or do you
No,
want?
whatever. No, I can go for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, in 5 minutes we'll take a break.
Okay.
Okay.
In our collections, we actually had also some papers of Jewish people. I did not really discover those till a little later on, but Walter Lippmann's papers, Max Lerner, who was born and grew up in New Haven,
Yeah.
his papers. He was one who had gone to Hill House and went to Yale, and there were others too, not many. One of the most interesting were the papers of Rose Pastor Stokes. Her maiden name Rose Pastor. She was a Russian immigrant who was working in a cigar wrapping factory at the age of 9 in Cleveland, but through dint of studying at night in a library managed to get herself as a writer for the Jewish Forward in New York, interviewed someone known as the millionaire socialist James Graham Phelps Stokes, who only happened to be the brother of Anson Phelps Stokes, who was the secretary of Yale. And they had a whirlwind romance and got married. And her papers are at Yale too. So this gave me a chance to stretch, but I think in terms of Jewish connection, one of the most exciting things was playing a small, but I thought helpful role in getting Judaic studies adopted as a major at Yale. That was in 1982. And I worked on an exhibit with there was not even a Judaic curator in the library at that time. There was a man who was for Near Eastern, anything in the Middle to Near East was covered by one person. And we worked very hard to pull together all the treasures that we had for a huge exhibit, which a lot of people came to, and when they saw the resources that Yale had, eventually this program was funded. We celebrated this through the Jewish Historical Society, because we were just about 5 years old then, by having a couple of events. We had at least two tours of the exhibit that we sponsored. And somehow word got to New York relatives or something, and the first day, the nave of the library was filled to capacity. I mean, we couldn't even have a tour. It was just like the sardines in an elevator. So we just had to kind of move among the crowd and tell people about it. And the same thing happened the second time. And then more for ourselves, but it also was open to, I guess, people in New Haven. I was able to arrange a dinner at Commons, an Israeli menu dinner. And I remember they had a beautiful ice sculpture, and they had other things. And Harvey, was very proud of that. And I can't remember how many people. I mean, it wasn't the entire 1,500 that could fit in there, but there were several hundred people that were able to come, and it certainly was a first to have an Israeli dinner in Commons.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun.
Rhoda. Oh,
Yeah.
oh.
I'm an archivist at Sterling Memorial Library. I know you had many publications. Two in particular were the Michelin Green Guide and the book that was edited by Richard Hagel, New Haven, an Illustrated History. You wrote the social history chapter. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with those and how you did your research for these things?
Certainly. Yeah, well, the Illustrated History I'll talk about first. That was published, the first edition, in 1981. And it turned out to be a great idea, a very successful project, because the long-standing sort of Bible of New Haven history was Roland Osterweiss's 3 Centuries of New Haven. It was published in, I believe, the very early 50s, maybe 51. But it was published as a tercentennial history for the 300th birthday of New Haven, which was 1938. So it only carried the story up until 1938. And so they wanted to have a new book that would also be illustrated and would be able to use a lot of the wonderful paintings and photographs at then, what was then called the New Haven Colony Historical Society, now shortened to the New Haven Museum. So the idea of the two editors, Richard Hagel and Floyd Shumway, who was the director, were to capitalize. They knew that there was probably not one person who could sit down again. Roland Osterweiss was still alive, but he was older and didn't seem to want to just participate in updating his book. So they thought the best way to proceed was to pick specialists who already knew a part of the history and have them focus on parts and then compile them together. And so I'm trying to think exactly how I think maybe because of, again, the role through the Jewish Historical Society, I had become quite involved at the New Haven Museum through cooperative exhibits that we did, and had used a lot of the materials there for one project or another. I guess my first big New Haven project, which is yet to be published, was to study the history of New Haven women. And I have boxes and boxes of notes on those. And so I may have even given a talk or two at the Historical Society. But because I was interested in women, I was interested in minority histories, as they sometimes called it then, I was asked to do the social history of New Haven, which I was very glad to do because not much had been written on the subject. And it included a timeline, which I compiled, of when all the ethnic groups first arrived. I think that was really probably the most important, I felt, contribution that I made, was compiling that timeline. And so that even though there may have been not too many sources yet for post-World War II history, at least we knew what we could strive to find, and we knew when the various groups came. And that continues to be in print, and it's very reasonably priced, too, at the New Haven Museum. I believe it's only $14 or $15. So it's still a very useful resource, but it's time for a new updating and probably new subjects that we haven't covered as well in the past. So it gave me sort of a track record too, as having published something. I had published a few things, but mostly short chapters or parts of things. And then in the late 80s, another thing that made me much more visible, especially to Yale alumni, was being asked to write a column, a feature for the Yale Alumni magazine called Old Yale. And this came about because, having worked with prints, photographs, not just manuscripts at Yale, it was known to this became known to some of the people at the Yale Club of New York. The Yale Club of New York is a high-rise hotel across the street from Grand Central Station. It had hundreds and hundreds of artworks in the form of prints, oil paintings, and photographs, many of which were disappearing off the walls of the rooms in the Yale Club. And with the feeling that I suppose some people thought, well, I'll leave them back in my will or whatever, but they couldn't resist, and they would take, especially if they were football scenes or something. And so they asked me to make a general appraisal of what they had there, how valuable it was, how many things they should keep or maybe try to sell or give away. And I worked on that for a while, intermittently. And then someone who was on the library committee that I had been working with on this was appointed as the new editor of the Yale Alumni magazine. He had been the architecture editor of New York magazine, and he was beginning to raise a family and wanted to live in the country of Connecticut. And so he took this job, which he felt would be easier commute and less stressful and so forth. And he said, as an architecture person and a graduate of the School of Yale Architecture School, he thought it would be great to have a back page that featured the great architecture of Yale. And he said, since you know all these buildings, I think you'd be a great person to do this. So it really started out with, say, almost a half a page or more of a picture and just kind of a very long caption almost, or of a couple of paragraphs. But as I began to do these, I personally got, well, not exactly bored, but I really felt that there was more of a story there as to what went on in these buildings, why they were built, how they became repurposed when that purpose was over, and so forth. So I began to sneak more and more in, and he liked that too. And so I began to expand in other ways, into sports, into people, various aspects of the history of Yale. So as the tercentennial was approaching, there was one other event that also I became involved with, and that was the celebration, the Special Olympics, International Olympics that were held in New Haven. And for Yale, they wanted to have a temporary museum of Yale history that was set up on the sort of festival area that was along in the harbor. And so I worked with other people, but I did a fair share of it, to set up this museum on Long Wharf that was up for several weeks in 2 tents. Oh, and we had things like a big cutout of Walter Camp with an actual recording of him. He invented the Daily Dozen exercises, so you could sort of do the exercises along with him. We had the dinosaurs there. We had the stories of everything interesting at Yale in this museum. In fact, and so a kind of replica of that, although not quite as good in a way in some ways, because it was reduced to more two-dimensional things, is in the Visitors Center at Yale at 149 Elm, and I also worked on that as well. So they knew Linda Lorimer, the secretary of the university, had worked on this too. So this kind of, from 1995, led right into planning for the tercentennial, which was in 2001, and we started working on that in about 1998. One of the things we knew we wanted was some sort of mapping or signage so that people could see the buildings of Yale and understand what one was from the other. And I remember I had talked about growing up in New Haven, where it just like the whole old campus kind of looked like a big castle. You really never had any idea that there were a whole string of buildings there.
Right.
And so Linda Lorimer said, we had a meeting of the committee, Linda Lorimer said, it would be great if we had something like a Michelin guide for Yale, wouldn't it? And she laughed. And Robin Winks, who was a history professor and also was in the process of writing a history of the national parks and was going from one park to another, and possibly may have worked on one Michelin guide or another. Anyway, he was familiar with them, and he said, well, let's ask Michelin. Maybe they'll do a guide. So Robin Winks was really the one who started the ball rolling, and this is what happened. So it was a one edition thing, and I'm sure Yale had a big input into saying how many copies of it they would buy, but I worked with an actual Michelin editor, and I did the writing for all of the content of the history of the buildings, the history of the customs, and she put it into the Michelin talk and the way an editor would set it up. And she also took care of the parts that listed, had the nuts and bolts of all the hotels and the restaurants and that kind of thing. It couldn't be a Michelin guide in terms of rating the food because, well, I don't think any of the food was of the Michelin ranking.
No stars?
But she would put in a few places that she liked. I mean, one of the places that the editor actually really liked was Naples. She felt it was just like a good, honest place for what it was. The pizza was good. She liked the way that they carved the tables there and had all the collegiate stuff. Most of those restaurants that are listed there actually aren't even in business anymore.
Yeah.
And from time to time they've talked about doing another one. I think if they do anything, it would probably be just an online project. But they could use another one. But I did a walking tour of, in addition to covering the campus, I did one of Worcester Square and one of Grove Street Cemetery. Very short ones, abbreviated ones that are in there as well. So that was a very interesting project. And it came at a critical period of my life when, at the time I started working on this, I actually developed breast cancer and was being treated for it. And I only bring this up because I'm not sure if I sent you that article, but it's mentioned in the alumni magazine, because I said, well, don't put her name, but Linda, in order to, so that I wouldn't be thinking about my illness, sent me a whole batch of stuff for the Michelin Guide, brought it over to the Yale Infirmary for me to work on. She said, just so you won't have time on your hands. And it was a good idea, because that really kept me going through the whole thing. And then some years later...
So this was in 2001?
It was published in 2000, actually, just ahead of the actual tercentennial. And I worked on other projects for the tercentennial before the actual celebration in the bowl. They had big screens with trivia questions about the history of Yale to keep people occupied. I worked on that, but it was mainly the Michelin Guide. There was also a course taught on the 20th century history of Yale by a history professor who actually had just completed a book on the subject. There were so many complaints, unfortunately, from people who felt they had not been included, or wanted their fathers to get more space or something like that. It's hard when you're working on a contemporary topic that he actually would never publish the book, which is unfortunate. But a course was developed on it that was taken by so many students that they ran out of TAs. So Gaddis Smith asked me if I would be a TA. And so I had that experience, which was a lot of fun, teaching the course. And that, as I say, I guess one thing has led to another, and over time I've sort of become the unofficial Yale historian. And then in 2012, not too long before John DeStefano stopped being the mayor and started teaching at Yale himself, I was appointed the city historian for New Haven. And that has brought some interesting challenges, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come. One of the first ones was when they were digging at the corner of Church and Crown Street and dug their way into a brick chamber under the street, and they wondered what it was. Well, I myself hadn't heard of those before in New Haven, but thanks to the internet and online searching, I found out that they were actually still even in a few cities where there's a lack of water. And these were water chambers that were filled before there were water systems in the city to have water to put out fires. When you think of those old little push or horse-drawn fire engines that have the bars on each side that you pump up and down, and that was how they would go to the corners, put a hose down, and they would pump the water up to put out the fires in whatever block. So they were originally scattered all around downtown New Haven. The only one I know of specifically is one that's at the corner of the cemetery on Grove and Prospect Street. And I imagine most of them have disappeared with rebuilding over time, because the water company put in the water system in 1859. So it's been a while. I guess the one that got the most attention all the way to the Huffington Post was the case of the Lincoln tree that fell over during Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. And that was very strange and almost spooky, you might say, because it was Halloween, and I'm almost 2012, yes, I was about to say 13, when in this stormy night, a homeless person who was venturing out onto the green saw that this huge tree had fallen over. And when the person got closer, thought he saw bones in the roots of this tree. So he was afraid, thinking someone maybe had been murdered and buried there not too long before, or what it might be. So it took a while before the story actually got out, until the daylight. And the police came, eventually various forensic experts were called in, and they finally determined that these bones were very old bones. And it was pointed out that the green there, the upper green where the tree fell over, was the former cemetery of New Haven before the Grove Street Cemetery. So it had been used from 1638 until 1797 or 8 as the burial place. And there were in fact thousands, nobody knows how many thousands of people that had been buried, eventually one on top of the other. So in addition to which, the tree, the only tree that fell over on the green, had been planted in 1909 for the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln, and this was done all over the country. And it was also associated with the early promotion of Arbor Day. And although the tree was planted later, more toward Arbor Day, they couldn't, in most places, plant anything in February where the birthday was because it was too cold. So this was a very famous tree, and when it was planted in 1909, they had put a time capsule in it. So this time capsule was also revealed at the time that the bones were revealed. And the time capsule was sealed in cement. It was very hard to break open. So what they decided to do, they called the right people, an archaeologist from Yale, and some specialists in detecting things through scientific spectroscopes, other ways of looking at things, at Quinnipiac were called in. And the time capsule turned out to be reflecting back to the Civil War, had been put in there by Civil War veterans who were still alive in 1909. And they put in their most treasured medals, bullets, anything that records that reflected back to the time of the Civil War. And a few things that reflected from 1909, the time they were putting in this capsule. Of course, no one knew if and when nobody knew the capsule was there if that particular tree hadn't fallen over.
Where did those things go? To the museum?
Yes.
The museum?
Yes. And the tree itself, which is interesting, was given over for art purposes. And one of the sculptures, which is of Lincoln, was purchased by the New Haven Museum. Another part was made into a bench that's in City Hall. And other parts possibly are still available for sale.
They had an exhibit there of
Yes.
some of the artists'
Yes.
work. I remember that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of artifacts that were created. Now the bones are still resting and being tested at Yale, and parts of them have been sent all over, because they felt was an interesting way for students. A lot of students have been involved. And there was a report given at a meeting at the New Haven Museum, but DNA keeps improving so much, so fast, that they still have not reburied these bones. And nor have I heard exactly where they're to be. I mean, we feel that since they were on the green, and the decision at the time was not to remove bones to the Grove Street Cemetery, people could move their headstones, but it had been decided to leave the bones as they were. And you may know that because of the fact that they had to build Temple Street, which had not existed before the late 18th century, the new church of United Church, well, and mainly actually Center Church, which was right over the bones, had to be rebuilt and set back. And so the basement of Center Church is that part of the graveyard. They call it the crypt, but it actually is just the old burial ground in the basement. And where they once thought there were 177 graves because there are that many stones, they now realize, having investigated one, that there are layers and layers, and they may have over 1,000 people or more buried right under the church.
Were any records kept of who was buried there?
Well, they certainly have the ones for the stones. I know the first Mrs. Benedict Arnold is there. And I think an older Hillhouse, James Hillhouse, who was the uncle of the famous James Hillhouse, is among some of the people that are buried there. In the bones that they discovered were, well, we don't know if they're really husband and wife, we presume so, a man, a woman, and at least 2 children, and I think some parts of others that seem to be disconnected and not connected with any precise person. The man that they've spent the most time with, they believe was someone who didn't work terribly hard. They could usually tell if someone has had a lot of wear and tear on their bones, was in his 20s, they haven't decided that he died of any particular cause that they know. But they've been sending little parts around to specialists like teeth and other things. And the only way they could ever associate them with anybody else is if somebody's DNA happened to pop up somewhere that could match theirs. I mean, there's no way you can go from DNA
Right.
just to finding out who somebody was.
Right.
Because they think they were buried, in the 1780s probably. And they did find a few beads, and they found the coffin nails. The coffin was completely had disappeared, disintegrated. But they did find the nails, and they found some colored beads that they thought either could have belonged to a child or might have possibly been beads that were worn. But
What was the population of New Haven then in the 1780s?
it was, well, at the time of the Revolution, it was about 4,000. It varies a lot as to what you count,
Right.
because it was New Haven was consolidated in 1784 into a city and lost a lot of parts that, like Westville,
right,
West Haven, all of those
right.
parts were dropped off. So some of it's hard to know because there wasn't any census until 1790.
So I was just wondering how many people could have died in the 1780s, because the population wasn't that big.
And
were there
also,
records about who died then?
there could be more work done. Another thing we found is that Noah Webster, who lived in New Haven most of his life as an adult, was one of the first writers in public health. And in the early 1790s, there was a lot of disease, especially in New Haven, caused, he thought, partly by a lot of pestilence. I mean, malaria was very common in the colonial days, yellow fever, smallpox. There were a lot of things that were going around. In addition, there were a lot of people who were getting sick and dying from bad shellfish. It was especially, it was that time when they were saying you shouldn't eat. You should only eat it in the R months, isn't that?
The oysters, right?
And although that is sort of debunked now by a lot of people, still in all, you have the harbor, which had a lot of ships and was getting shallower and shallower, and there was so much shellfish that poor people especially were very dependent on it. I mean, you could just practically reach in and pull out a lobster, I think, in those days. That people ate a lot of shellfish. It was not considered a delicacy the way it's become today. So it's still there as an opportunity for research.
Yeah, interesting.
And it's something I want to go back to myself.
And on a final note, you were involved in the research when a cornerstone was found of a synagogue on Olive Street, B'nai Shalom.
Yes, that was a very exciting story for the Jewish Historical Society. It really put us on the map and got us into the New York Times. And I think Warner was a major player in that because of his language abilities and the fact that there was a mixture of German and Yiddish and Hebrew and all that went on with the contents of that box. But it was the site of the synagogue that had broken away from Mishkan Israel. When Mishkan Israel decided to become Reform in 1865, the part that didn't want to be Reform formed a new synagogue, which at some point, I guess it was 1895 or thereabouts, built a synagogue on Olive Street. And eventually, that was taken over, I believe, by an architectural firm. We have the record on that can be edited or corrected. And I mean, what was interesting was that we were known enough in New Haven that when they found this, and it came to the attention of the powers that be in New Haven, and even at the New Haven Historical Society, they felt that an expert, someone from the Jewish Historical Society, should be the one to open it and analyze the contents. And so we were all brought together and shown the contents.
Where did this take place?
I think it was at our headquarters when it was at the Jewish Home, at the Jewish Home for the Aged, where we spent some productive time. And one thing we didn't get in today was also the the getting of the endowment, National Endowment for the Humanities grant to first process the archives in 1980. So that's probably why, again, we were better known, because we had an archivist that we hired for 2 years plus a little, and we were beginning to really know what we had. So this was a great addition to the archives to have this box, which contained, I believe, a book of prayers. It contained, I think, a hymn or something from that period. And newspapers of the day. And one thing that they thought was most amusing was a little slip of paper in the bottom that was written in Yiddish, and it said, "I'm the man who made this box."
It was a copper box, wasn't it?
Yes.
We have the box here.
Yeah, and it was sealed. Yes, I mean that's it. So it had to be kind of open like you would open a can, I believe.
Yeah, well, that's where the top, as I recall, I haven't seen it in a while, it's like sort of ripped up,
Yes.
open. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow,
That's
we should make that part of the video, you know?
That's
I have to go look
That's
for
right.
it.
Right,
And
right.
we need to celebrate these things
Right,
from
right.
time to time.
Well, I left out a lot because so much of your history is covered in materials that have already been written about you, Judy. And I think the talk that you gave at the Jewish Historical Society's 40th anniversary annual meeting, it has a lot of the history of the Jewish Historical Society and your involvement with that. And I think that could be included in our publication of Jews in New Haven, Volume 10, along with some of this biographical information. So anything we've left out that you think is important for us to cover?
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Another time or somewhere, I think, and it has been written about in our series of books, is about the changes of the Jewish population at Yale and the acceptance of Jews, ending up with having had 2 Jewish presidents of Yale in a row,
Yeah.
and one who had a certain Jewish heritage, Hannah Gray. So things have come a long way.
Right, right. Is there anything you'd like to say about that now?
Well, again, I know it was remarkable when I was teaching the section of the history of Yale in the 20th century. One boy put up his hand and he said, I went to a Yale tea with the grads, and they were having prospective students and new students, and he said, this old fellow said to me, "I hear they have Jews at Yale now." And the student looked at him and he said, "Yeah," like he had no idea what the question was for.
Yeah.
And he said yes, but to the older man, he was just amazed that there was a real Jewish presence at Yale. And I guess I could tell this story too, since it's an oral history, but in the early years when I worked at Yale, the associate librarian was an advisor for the library science program at Southern. And we got along very well, and sometimes he would drive me to class so that I wouldn't have to go home and get my car if he was out there on official business. And he confidentially told me at one point, he said, "You're a very talented woman," and he said, "I think you have a great career in front of you," but he said, as a woman and a Jew, Yale may not be the place for you."
Who was this who said this?
The associate librarian.
Ah.
I mean, he said he was telling me this as advice, not that he wanted to get rid of me. At least that's how he phrased it. So, I mean, I think I could understand that. In my own life, I still saw it as a plus to be at Yale, and my personal life was such that I really didn't want to leave New Haven anyway. But the archives that I visited could not compare in any way to what I was experiencing at Yale. So I'm very glad that I did not follow his advice.
Besides that statement, did you experience any kind of discrimination because of...
I would say more as a woman in the earlier years. I mean, they used to say about professions that when a profession becomes lucrative, that's when men take it over. And I think to a degree that was happening in the library field. I mean, first there were mainly men, but then you had many women sort of in the rank and file, like head of cataloging, head of reference. But even those sort of intermediary heads were all being taken over by men. I think as it became a profession for more than dilettantes or people who just loved rare books or something like that. And I think there was a period, and we didn't get our first woman librarian, university librarian, until the 1990s, at which point I'd certainly been working at Yale quite a while.
How did having Jewish presidents change the nature of anything at Yale?
I think when it happened, it didn't change very much. I think it had just come to a point where there were trustees, members of the corporation, various professors and deans. Now, we mentioned Roland Osterweiss before. He was the first Jewish professor in the humanities. There was a tradition at Yale that it was okay to be Jewish and teach something scientific or technical, a language, the medical school, science. Lafayette Mendel, who was considered the inventor of labeling vitamins. When he went both to Yale College, he had his education, he taught at Yale, but he was also teaching a subject that was nutrition, which was mainly taken by women PhDs. It was sort of where they channeled all the women in the early part of the 20th century. The humanities was pretty much a no-no, especially English literature. There's a certain feeling that unless you were a true Christian, you could not properly appreciate Shakespeare and the various great literary people of England. And that, I think, was the last to change, was in literature.
Did the building of the Slivka Center change things for Jewish life?
It certainly promoted, I think. I mean, of course, there was Hillel. It was a much smaller facility on High Street, and they had the kosher kitchen on Crown Street. They used that facility that years ago had been a mission house for Yale, but certainly made it much easier and much more attractive. I think especially to, say, less committed Jewish people who were, I think, more uniformly welcomed in, whether they were Jewish by heritage or whatever their connection might have been. They were made to feel comfortable with organizing the trips to Israel for people that were practically unaffiliated and so forth. Certainly added a lot to, and with their art exhibits, they have so much more room to do things.
Right. Well, this has been wonderful talking to you, and I always learn so much whenever we talk, Judy. I'm sure there are things that I'm not asking you that I wish I had asked you. Anything you can think of, Marv?
No, she covered more than I expected.
She covered a lot. Right.
Wow.
Thank you. Any last words?
Well, thank you, Rhoda, for your patience, and thank you, Marvin. It's been a great afternoon. Thank you.
This has been fun. Okay.